On the morning of April 16th, 2024, the impossible happened in one of the driest places on the entire planet. In Dubai, a gleaming desert city that sees barely a few inches of rain in an entire year, the sky opened up, and it simply did not stop. Within hours, the images pouring out of the city looked less like a weather report and more like the end of the world. Luxury cars, Rolls-Royces, Aston Martins, the everyday traffic of one of the wealthiest cities on Earth, floated down flooded boulevards like abandoned boats. 8-lane highways vanished completely beneath churning brown rivers of water. Shopping malls took on water. And at Dubai International Airport, the single busiest airport on the planet for international travel, enormous passenger jets taxied slowly through standing water, throwing up wakes like ships at sea, past terminals that had been turned into islands. In a single day, this desert city was hit with more rain than it normally receives in well over a year. It was the heaviest rainfall the country had experienced in 75 years, reaching back before the record-keeping had even begun. And almost immediately, as the water rose and one of the most modern cities on Earth ground to a complete halt, the world reached for an explanation that felt satisfying and shocking and turned out to be almost entirely wrong. This is the story of the day Dubai drowned, how a city built to conquer the desert was brought to its knees by water, why it flooded so catastrophically, and why the thing that nearly everyone rushed to blame was not in fact the cause at all. So let me walk you through what actually happened, because the scale of it is genuinely hard to absorb. The Great Storm did not begin in the way. It first slammed into neighboring Oman over the weekend before it swung north and pounded the United Arab Emirates on Tuesday, the 16th of April. And when it arrived, it broke everything. In Dubai itself, more than 140 millimeters of rain, over 5.5 inches, fell in roughly 24 hours. To understand how staggering that is, you have to know that Dubai's average rainfall for an entire year is only around 3 inches. So, in the span of a single day, the city was hit with well over a year's worth of rain. By some measures, closer to a year and a half's worth, all at once. And out in the city of Al Ain, a weather station recorded an astonishing 254 millimeters of rain, the single heaviest reading anywhere in the country in the 75 years since national records began, back in 1949, before crude oil had even been discovered in the region. The consequences were immediate and overwhelming. Dubai International Airport, the beating heart of global air travel, saw its runways submerged, its flights halted and diverted, and its operations thrown into chaos for days on end. The city's vast network of highways became impassable, littered with abandoned and half-submerged vehicles. Homes and villas flooded. The metro was disrupted. Schools were shut, and workers were ordered to stay home. People found themselves trapped in their cars and in their houses as the water rose around them, and it was not without a human cost. 4 people lost their lives in the United Arab Emirates. And across the border in Oman, which had taken the storm's first and heaviest blow, more than 20 people were killed, including a group of schoolchildren whose vehicle was swept away by the floodwaters. And the disruption did not simply end when the rain stopped. At Dubai's airport, a hub through which tens of millions of international travelers pass every year, making it the busiest of its kind on the entire planet, the chaos rippled outward across the globe for days. Well over 1,000 flights were canceled or diverted. Passengers were left stranded in the terminals, sleeping on floors, unable to reach or leave the city, as the airport pleaded with people to stay away unless absolutely necessary. Roads to the airport were themselves underwater, so even those who managed to land often could not get out. In a city and a country that had built its entire modern identity around being a seamless, futuristic global crossroads, the most basic machinery of movement had simply seized up. For days afterward, residents were still bailing out flooded homes, abandoning ruined cars, and picking their way through neighborhoods where the water refused to drain. A single day of rain had brought one of the most connected cities on Earth to a standstill that lasted the better part of a week. And then, as the surreal videos spread across the world at lightning speed, the internet found its culprit. Almost instantly, one single explanation began to race across social media, repeated and shared millions of times: cloud seeding. Now, To understand why this theory caught fire so quickly, you first have to understand what cloud seeding actually is. The United Arab Emirates, desperate for fresh water in its bone-dry climate, runs one of the most active weather modification programs anywhere in the world. The idea is to fly small aircraft up into promising clouds and release tiny particles, often a kind of salt, into them. These particles give the water droplets in the cloud something to cling to and condense around, encouraging them to grow heavy enough to fall as rain. In effect, it is an attempt to coax a little extra rain out of clouds that are already there and already primed to produce it. And to many people, it sounds almost like science fiction human beings, quite literally, making it rain in the desert. The technique itself is not new at all. It was first developed back in the 1940s, and dozens of countries have experimented with it over the decades since, from the United States to China. The Wu has been especially committed to it, flying hundreds of missions a year in an effort to squeeze whatever extra water it can from its rare passing clouds. So the raw idea that the Wu had been tampering with the weather was not, in itself, some wild conspiracy theory. It was simply describing a real program that genuinely exists, and the confusion was made worse in the first frantic hours when a few reports quoted officials suggesting that several seeding flights had gone up shortly before the storm, a claim the UAE's own weather authority would later dispute, saying no seeding had been carried out in the immediate lead up to the deluge. But in the fog of a breaking disaster, the distinction was lost, and the story hardened into fact in the public mind almost overnight. So the theory practically wrote itself. The way, everyone reasoned, must have seeded the clouds, and it had gone catastrophically, disastrously wrong. They had tried to squeeze out a little rain, and had somehow flooded their own greatest city instead. Reports even began to circulate that seeding flights had indeed gone up in the days just before the storm hit. It was, on the surface, an absolutely perfect story, a tale of technological arrogance, of a nation that had tried to play God with the weather and had been humbled by its own hubris. It spread everywhere. There was just one small problem with it. It was almost certainly not true. Because the moment you actually understand what cloud seeding is genuinely capable of doing, the entire theory simply falls to pieces. And here is the crucial point, the one thing you most need to grasp. Cloud seeding does not and cannot create rain out of nothing. It cannot summon water from a clear blue sky or conjure a downpour from a small, thin cloud. The absolute most that it can do, and even this remains genuinely debated among scientists, and is modest at the very best, is to nudge an existing, already rain-ready cloud into releasing a little more of the water it was already holding onto. Perhaps a 10 or 15% boost, under ideal conditions. As one former chief scientist at the United States National Weather Agency put it, about as bluntly as it is possible to put it, you simply cannot create 6 inches of water out of thin air. To claim that cloud seeding produced this flood, he said, is essentially to believe in a perpetual motion machine. Think about the sheer quantity of water involved. To dump more than a year's worth of rain onto an entire city, you need a genuinely colossal amount of moisture in the atmosphere and an enormous, powerful storm system to wring it all out. Vastly, unimaginably more water than a handful of small planes releasing salt particles could ever hope to influence in the slightest. And the definitive proof lies in the storm itself. This was not some small, localized cloudburst that hovered neatly over Dubai. It was a massive, sprawling regional storm system, one that also drenched Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, a storm that had struck Oman a full 2 days before it ever reached the way. And, most tellingly of all, meteorologists had seen it coming. They had forecast this storm accurately, watching it develop and track across the region up to a week in advance. You do not forecast a cloud seeding accident a week ahead of time. What you forecast that far out is a real, natural, large-scale weather system doing exactly what the atmosphere told you it would do. The cloud seeding story was compelling and dramatic and deeply shareable. It was also, quite simply, scientifically impossible. So if it wasn't cloud seeding, what did cause it? And here the real answer is at once less mysterious and in its own way considerably more concerning. What struck the region was a powerful large-scale storm what meteorologists technically call a mesoscale convective system. That is essentially a vast cluster of individual thunderstorms that merge and organize together into a single, enormous complex, covering hundreds of miles and capable of unleashing torrential rainfall for many hours or even for days at a stretch. This is a completely natural, well-understood weather phenomenon. But this particular storm was feeding on an atmosphere that was unusually warm and unusually heavy with moisture, and that is precisely where the deeper story begins to emerge. Because there is a simple, ironclad law of physics operating at the very heart of all of this, one that sits at the absolute center of why the weather across our whole planet is changing, and it is this: warmer air holds more water. For every single degree that the atmosphere warms, it becomes capable of holding roughly 7% more moisture. So as the planet heats up, the air even over the warm and famously arid Persian Gulf can now carry more water vapor than it ever could before. And when a big, powerful storm system comes rolling along to squeeze that atmospheric sponge, it can wring out significantly more rain than the very same storm ever could have in a cooler world. A team of climate scientists who rapidly analyzed the Dubai deluge and its immediate aftermath concluded exactly this: that human-caused warming had most likely made this kind of extreme rainfall event meaningfully heavier, by their estimate, somewhere in the range of 10 to 40% heavier than it otherwise would have been. This event, they concluded, was very much in line with what we should now expect from a warming world. The real culprit, in other words, was never a plain full of salt. It was a hotter atmosphere, holding a great deal more water. But here is the part that truly turns a bad storm into a genuine catastrophe, and it has almost nothing to do with the rain itself, and almost everything to do with the city that the rain happened to fall upon. Because a heavy rainstorm is one thing. A heavy rainstorm falling on a city that was built as though it would never ever rain is something else entirely. Think carefully about what Dubai actually is. It is one of the most audacious and ambitious cities on the face of the earth, a dazzling metropolis of mirrored glass towers, of immense shopping malls, and of enormous, sprawling multi-lane highways, all of it conjured up out of the bare desert sand in a matter of just a few decades. And it was built, entirely understandably, for the climate that it actually has, a hyper-arid desert climate that delivers only a few scant inches of rain in a typical year. And in a place like that, the logic seems perfectly sound. Why on earth would you spend billions of dollars building a vast, comprehensive stormwater drainage system to handle rain that almost never comes? And so, by and large, they didn't. Dubai is, in the words of one observer, essentially a concrete jungle, mile upon mile of asphalt roadways, of paved plazas, and of sealed glass and stone surfaces, with relatively little of the drainage, the storm sewers, the open green space, and the bare, absorbent soil that a rainier city quietly relies upon to soak up and carry away a serious downpour. And that combination creates a genuinely deadly trap. When extreme rain falls on a city of hard, sealed, impermeable surfaces that water cannot soak down into the ground, because there is barely any exposed ground left for it to soak into. It cannot drain away quickly enough, because the drainage was simply never built for anything remotely like this. And on the flat, level desert terrain, it cannot easily run off and away to anywhere else. So it does the only thing left for it to do. It pools, and it rises, and it floods, transforming highways into rivers and airport runways into lakes. The vulnerability, in a very real and literal sense, had been built directly into the city long before the very first raindrop ever fell. The desert did not defeat Dubai that day. Dubai's own concrete did. And there is a genuine, almost poetic irony buried in the whole affair. Dubai has spent decades, and quite literally untold fortunes, engineering its way around the single fundamental problem of being located in the middle of a desert, importing water from abroad, manufacturing fresh water from the sea, air conditioning its every indoor space, and yes, seeding its own skies, doing absolutely everything within human power to wring a little more precious moisture out of a stubbornly dry environment. And then, in the span of a single astonishing day, it received a catastrophic, overwhelming overdose of the very thing it is perpetually chasing. The same city that flies airplanes up into the clouds to beg the sky for rain found itself, for one utterly surreal afternoon, drowning in it. And it points toward a larger and a far more sobering truth about the era that we are now entering. Because as the climate warms, we are not simply going to get a little bit hotter everywhere in a nice, even, predictable way. What we are getting instead is a world of intensifying extremes, a world where already wet places can become catastrophically wetter, and where even the driest places on the map, when the rain finally does arrive, can be struck by downpours far heavier than anything their infrastructure was ever remotely designed to withstand. Cities all across the world, the vast majority of them carefully built for the stable and predictable climate of the past century, are increasingly going to find themselves confronting weather that they were simply never built to survive. Dubai's flood was a spectacular, unforgettable, headline-grabbing example of exactly this. But it will not be the last of them, and Dubai is very far from the only city on Earth that is quietly at risk. In fact, there is a quiet assumption buried underneath almost every drainage pipe, every storm sewer, and every flood barrier ever built, all around the world, the assumption that the future weather will behave more or less like the weather of the past. Engineers designed these systems around historical records, the heaviest storm in 50 years, the worst flood in a century. Built to handle that, the thinking went, and you were safe. But that entire assumption is now quietly breaking down. In a warming atmosphere, the storm that used to arrive once a century can start arriving every few decades, and the once in 50 years downpour can become something a city sees several times in a single lifetime. Which means that drainage systems the world over, in wealthy cities and poor ones alike, are increasingly undersized for the climate that is actually arriving, not because anyone made a mistake, but because they were built for a world that is slipping into the past. Dubai simply offered the most dramatic possible illustration of a problem that quietly threatens almost everywhere. So let me end, as I always try to, with honesty and with genuine balance, because this story is far too easily turned into a cheap joke, and the joke misses the entire point. Let me be scrupulously fair to Dubai here, because it is very easy to point and laugh at images of flooded supercars and a drowned airport, and doing so completely misses the real and important lesson. The plain truth is that no city anywhere on Earth could have simply shrugged off more than a year's worth of rain in a single day without suffering serious, crippling flooding. Not London, not New York, not Tokyo, not any of them. This was a genuinely extraordinary, once in many generations storm by any measure. And to its credit, the Way has responded to it. In the aftermath, the country announced major new investments in stormwater drainage and flood control infrastructure, precisely so that it might be better prepared the next time the skies open. The forecasting, remember, worked beautifully. The warnings arrived a full week ahead of the storm. The real failure was never one of prediction. It was the failure of a city, like so very many cities around the world, to have been built for a climate that is now, unmistakably, shifting beneath its feet. And the cloud seeding myth, for all of its irresistible appeal, actually does real harm, because it distracts us completely from the far more important truth. This was not some freak accident caused by human beings meddling with a single storm and getting it wrong. It was a natural storm, made heavier by a warming atmosphere, falling upon a city that had no real way to cope with it. The genuine lesson of the Great Dubai Flood is not be more careful with cloud seeding. The genuine lesson is that the weather itself is changing, and that the cities we so carefully built for the old familiar weather are not ready for the new. So the next time you happen to see those surreal and unforgettable images, the passenger jet taxiing slowly through the floodwater, the luxury car bobbing gently down the flooded avenue, the world's busiest airport transformed into an inland sea, I want you to remember what they truly represent. Not a science experiment gone wrong, not human beings accidentally conjuring a flood from the sky, but something simpler and something far more important than either. A warming world delivering a downpour that a desert city was never built to survive, and a warning written out in floodwater across the surface of one of the most modern cities that humanity has ever built. That the stable climate we quietly designed our entire world around is already, right now, slipping away from us. Dubai rose, impossibly, out of the driest of all deserts, And for one truly astonishing day, it discovered that in the world we are now building, even the desert can drown.